To start out, we're going to take the bodice front and the two bodice back pieces. We're going to put them right sides together. And I do like to line mine up so that I know I'm not going to sew something backwards or upside down. And we're going to sew across the top of each shoulder. So I generally just put one pin in the top of each shoulder. And then we're going to sew a 1/2 inch seam across the top of each shoulder. Now this next part I did backwards. I wasn't even paying attention to my own directions. So your sleeves and your skirt should not be attached yet. It should just be the front attached to the back at the shoulders. And we're going to attach those lace kind of fake suspenders, if you will. So what you're going to do is line them up on the bottom of the dress, and there should be markers on the pattern. If you'd like to copy those markers over to your actual dress with like some chalk, or they make washable pens and things, you can draw those lines on if you'd like. Otherwise, you can kind of estimate it. So we're going to start at the bottom of the dress, and we're going to sew it up to the shoulders and back down the other side. And again, this will be much easier for you than it was for me because I had already attached my skirt. And what you want to do at the bottom of it, you do want to sew horizontally across the bottom of the lace to attach it to the bottom of the bodice. Even though no one will see that part, it'll make it easier when you attach it to the skirt, so the bottom of the lace doesn't get like folded into the skirt at all while you're sewing it. It'll just help it lay nice and flat and make it very easy to attach the skirt later on. So do so across the bottom of it. And I used a zigzag stitch. You can use a straight stitch. It kind of just depends on what ribbon you chose. I chose a zigzag and I used pink thread to just make it kind of interesting to look at. So if you have decorative edge on your thread, you can just use a straight stitch. And again, just sew all the way up to the shoulder seam and then back down the other side. And when we get to the bottom of this, we're going to do the same thing that we did on the front. When you get to the bottom, you need to pick up the foot and turn everything so that you can sew across the bottom of your lace as well, or your ribbon as well, so that it attaches the bottom of the ribbon to the bodice as well. And now we're just going to do the exact same thing on the other side. Now we're going to start working on the sleeves. So right where they start to turn, we're just going to baste across the top or do a gathering stitch, whatever you call it, which just means the length of our stitch we're going to raise to about 5. So that's not the zigzaggy stitch on your machine, it's the straight line one, in case you didn't remember. And we're going to do that on both sides. And I usually just do the curved part of the top of the sleeve. And then you're going to hold one of the threads really tight and just pull all the fabric. My fabric was really thin, so it went really fast. And it actually partially gathered while I was even sewing it. If you're using something like a cotton or things like that, you probably will have to do a little more gathering to actually get it together that tight. And we're going to start pinning it all the way across. What I like to do, we're pinning it to the bodice now, and make sure that the right sides are together. I pin one pin at each end of the bodice, so the armholes, and then I take the sides, and I want the sides to lay flat because I want as much of that gather as possible to be at the top. So I kind of push that gathering towards the center while I'm pinning. And then we're going to sew across that, and just make sure that your stitches are on the other side, so to the left of your gathering stitches, just so that those don't show in your final seam. They'll be hidden on the inside. And just sew all the way across that. And we're going to do the same thing on the other side when we're done as well. So on the other armhole. And again, remember to back stitch or do a lock stitch at the beginning and end of all of your stitches. And there we go. So there's one attached. You might be able to pull those gathering stitches out. You might not. Either way is fine. So now we're going to do the other side. We want to put the right sides together. So you want the right side of the bodice facing up when you put the sleeves on top. And again, I put one pin on each corner first, and then I just start pinning towards the center from each side to make sure that all the gathering is right in the middle, so that it'll be right on top of the sleeve. And you can just pull each end of the sleeves to make it the same length of the bodice armhole. I always think it's easier to gather too much and have to kind of pull it open a little than not gather enough and try to gather it more while I'm pinning it. And again, we're just going to sew across the top of this again and make sure that those gathering stitches are on the right of your needle so that they don't show in the finished seam, just in case you can't pull it all the way out. You don't have to pull it out at all. You can leave it in there if you want. But again, that's why we sew to the left of those stitches so that they don't show on the outside of the dress. And there we go, both sleeves are attached. So now we're going to do another gathering stitch or basting stitch across the whole bottom of the sleeve. And again, all that means is we're going to lengthen our stitch length to about 5, and then you'll hold tight to one of the threads and gather everything. And like I said earlier, I used really thin fabric, so mine kind of gathered while I sewed it. If you're using a sturdy cotton, it's not going to do that. But again, just hold one end of the thread really tight and gather it. And you want to gather this like all the way, as much as you possibly can. And then take the sleeve ends, the little bands for the bottom of each sleeve, fold it in half, and just iron across the top of that really well. So now mine's ironed in half. And I'm going to start pinning it to the sleeve. And I actually start where the sleeve meets the bodice. And I overlapped about 1/2 inch on each end just to make sure that I would have enough room to sew the edges of those together eventually. And like I said earlier, I always, when I'm pinning something that's gathered, I usually start by putting one pin on each end and then working my way towards the centers. So the flat parts all line up as we go towards the center. And there's kind of corners there. You can trim those corners or round them off because you're not going to sew that corner like that. That's just kind of how the pattern worked out for some reason. And I had to open my gathering just a little bit to be the same length as that sleeve closure. And do make sure that you have the right sides together for this. So I'm looking at the inside of my bodice right now, and the sleeve end is on the other side, so the right sides are together. And you can kind of see there that the edges, those corners are poking out, because I'm not going to sew those corners. I don't want it to be boxy. You can trim them off if that helps. But there we go. Here's from the right side. We're going to do the same thing on the other end. So again, I had already ironed this one really well in half. Start where the sleeve meets the bodice. So where the armhole starts on the bodice. And I like to pin each edge and work my way towards the center. Once it's pinned really well, we're just going to sew across all of that at about like a 1/4 to a 1/2 inch seam. And then again, just make sure that you sew on the other side of those gathering stitches so that they don't show when you turn it right side out. If you need to, you can always kind of pull the whole sleeve. They don't have to, the edges don't have to line up perfectly if that helps you to make sure that the gathering stitches aren't going to be inside of your seam. You can kind of pull it over a little bit if that makes sense. It also helps too when you do those gathering stitches. It's going to be easier if you sew them at like a 1/4 inch and not a 1/2 inch. And then just back stitch at the end when you get to the end. And we're going to do the exact same thing on the other side as well. Okay, now that each sleeve is officially attached to the bodice, and again, your lace should already be attached at this point, sorry about that. We're going to sew down the side of the sleeves and down the side of the bodice. So line up where those finished edges of the sleeves are and start there. So we're going to turn it right sides together. Make sure all those poofies are on the inside. And again, we're lining up that finished edge that we just sewed. And I usually just put like one pin there to hold it in place. They're just straight lines. If you want to pin the whole thing, go ahead. If that helps you, then definitely do it. But I usually don't. But again, if you're a beginner, I would say go ahead and pin that whole straight edge. It might help you out. And just sew down from the start all the way down the sleeve and the side of the bodice. And here I just evened up those bottom parts. Mine didn't line up just perfectly. So while I'm already there, I just like to even them up a little bit so they line up. And again, I'm doing the same thing on the other side. We want to make sure those finished edges are lined up really good. Make sure you back stitch or lock stitch at the beginning. We're going to sew down the side of the sleeve and straight down the side of the bodice. And then this is the neck hole. So on the shoulders, we're just going to trim back a corner. So right where the neck hole is at the shoulder, we're going to take a triangle out of each corner so that it's a lot closer to the seam. And then we're going to switch over to a rolled hem foot. If you don't have a rolled hem foot, you can cut notches the whole way across. Fold the neckline back 1/2 inch and just sew across those folds. But I think it looks a lot nicer if you use an actual rolled hem foot. So all you do is fold the fabric back about 1/4 inch, put your needle in with the foot still up, and then you can just wiggle the fabric into the foot before you place it down, and then sew right across. And since we cut those notches out of the shoulders, it will sew right over that seam and not get stuck. If you leave that bulk in there and don't cut those corners out at the shoulders, it'll all get jammed when it tries to pull it through and roll it. But since we cut those out, it'll just go right over those seams. Really nice for us. And we're on the inside of the fabric. We do this on the wrong side of the fabric so that it's rolling it inside towards the inside of the dress. And with a rolled hem foot, you really only want to do about 1 back stitch, because if you try to pull everything back into that rolled hem foot back stitching, it's going to jam. So now we're going to work on the skirt since the top is done. We're going to line up the top corners and we're going to baste or gather stitch the whole way across. Make sure you switch back to your regular foot. Excuse me. And again, all this means is we're increasing the length of our stitch to about 5 and sewing the whole way across the top of the skirt. So this attaches the lace to the lining and it allows us to gather it all in one step. And I accidentally cut my lace a little bit too long. That's okay. It'll get trimmed out when I sew the back together. So then just hold one of those threads really tight and start pulling your fabric across the thread. And just gather it. Again, I like to gather as much as I can. And now we're going to put the right sides together. And again, when I gather, I like to put 1 pin at each end first. And then I work my way towards the center. So I just start ungathering a little bit so that it's the right length. And again, I just think it's easier to ungather than have to try to pull those threads tighter while I'm sewing. And we're going to put a pin in the centers. And here, when you're doing this, you can put as many pins as you'd like or as few pins as you'd like. But this is, while you're doing this, this is when you want to make sure that your gathering is as even as possible the whole way across the skirt. If you're having trouble with this, before you actually gather the skirt, so while it's still laying flat, put a pin in the center of the skirt and then maybe a pin in like 1/4 of the way through the skirt and 3/4 of the way through the skirt. And it'll help you, that center pin in the skirt, after it's been gathered, you just line that up with the center bodice. And then the ones about 1/4 of the way and 3/4, you line those up with the side seams in the bodice, if that helps you make sure that it's gathered evenly the whole way across. But once you have that pinned really well, we're just going to sew across that whole bottom of the bodice, top of the skirt. And you, again, make sure that you sew on the left of your gathering stitch so that that gathering stitch isn't visible in your finished dress, especially with really long pieces like this that we've gathered. It makes it a lot harder to pull that gathering stitch out, so really just make sure that it's going to be on the inside of the dress and nobody sees it. Okay, now we are going to attach a zipper. So I'm a visual person. I like to look at everything the way it's supposed to be laid out first. So I place my zipper on the way it's supposed to be, and then I turn it in towards the fabric. I fold the top of the zipper down. Some people trim it off. I just fold it down. And just make sure if you fold it down that you fold it down at a little bit of an angle so it's not in the way of the zipper teeth. And I've switched to a zipper foot. We're going to do a back stitch or lock stitch at the beginning and then just sew straight down the bodice. You can pin this whole thing if you'd like. That's totally fine. And if you have a short zipper like mine and you need to move the actual zipper up, just lift your foot, and you might need to lift your needle a little bit like I did, but just make sure that you don't pull the needle all the way out so that you don't lose your place where you're sewing. And then just trim your threads. And what I like to do at the top of it is fold it back because it likes to lay flat. If I fold it back and then I just put 2 or 3 stitches in the top there and just, kind of back and forth stitch them a little so it doesn't fall out, it just helps it to stay turned back. We're going to do the same thing on the other side. So I'm visual. I like to see where it's supposed to sit. So I kind of zip it up to make sure it's not twisted and lay it how it's supposed to go. Turn it in towards the fabric, fold that top down. And I do like to put it next to the other side to make sure they're about the same height. Okay, so when it's folded down, put your needle down and your foot down, back stitch that top a little bit, and then just sew right down the bodice. And again, if you need to move your actual zipper up, lift the foot up, and you can lift the needle part of the way if you need to. Just don't let the needle come all the way out of the fabric. Otherwise, you're going to lose your spot where you're sewing. And it might make like a bubble in the thread when you do that. And your zipper's going to get caught on it, basically. So just go all the way down, back stitch at the back as well. Trim those threads. And then you can tack that back again like I did on the other side, where just fold it back and then sew a couple stitches at the top. Now we're going to start working on the rest of the way down the back. So I just kind of like to pinch the zipper a little to figure out where that seam really is. You can pin this whole side if you want. It probably will be much easier. I just put my needle in the top down and then I line up all 4 layers. But really, you might want to pin it because you need to make sure that you hit all 4 layers. And you want to stop an inch or 2 before the bottom. And see how the bottom of mine aren't quite lined up? That's why I sew most of the way down before I get to this part, because then I can see if they line up or not. And I'm just going to trim them to be the same length. So again, I'm just trimming the lining to be the same length. And again, if you sew most of the way down the back, you'll have a much better visual of where they line up at the bottom to make sure that they are the same length. I'm switching back to my rolled foot again, and I'm going to do a rolled hem the whole way across. Again, if you don't have a rolled hem, a rolled hem foot, just fold the fabric back about 1/2 inch and sew the whole way across. But otherwise, if you have a rolled hem but you can use that. My fabric was fraying really bad. It was a really lightweight fabric, so a rolled hem is just going to help to stop it from fraying. But you don't have to use a rolled hem foot. If you just want to fold it back 1/2 inch and sew the whole way across, you can do that instead. But again, right now we're just hemming the lining the whole way across. And then once we've reached the other end, then we can finish up that last 1 or 2 inches of that back seam. So I'm back on my regular foot, and I'm just going to sew those last couple inches of the back seam. And this is where you want to trim up your lace as well to be the same length. Mine was a net, so you don't have to finish that edge. You just leave it raw because it does not fray at all if you use a netted lace. A way to tell if yours is going to fray or not is just to kind of wrap your fingers along the edge of it. And if it starts to fray, you know that you need to hem the lace as well. But if it doesn't, just go ahead and leave it. And then you're done. Yay! You did it. I would love to see how yours turns out. Please send me a picture or comment below. If you have any questions, just comment, or you can message me from wherever you bought your pattern. And I'd be more than happy to help you out. But hopefully this was helpful. And again, I would love to see how yours turns out. Thanks for watching.